Hi, everyone. Welcome to Shielded Dialogues. This is a new video series from Shielded Labs where we talk about what's happening in Zcash development. I'm Jason McGee, and in each episode, I'll be sitting down with people from Shielded Labs and across the Zcash ecosystem to talk about what we're working on and why it matters. Each episode will be short so that it's easy to follow along without a big time commitment. We're starting this series as part of our effort to build in public, to be more transparent about our work, hold ourselves accountable, and give both the Zcash community and a broader audience a clearer view of what's happening in development. A lot of important work in Zcash happens behind the scenes, and we want to do a better job of communicating it. Zcash has a strong developer ecosystem and a global community, but if you're not following closely, it's not always obvious how much progress is being made. So by sharing these conversations, we hope to highlight the work that's being done, bring in new contributors, and show that Zcash is actively evolving. For Shielded Labs, this is also an opportunity to establish who we are and build our brand. We're a relatively new organization in the Zcash ecosystem, and building in public means sharing what we're working on and why we think it's important. We want people inside and outside of the Zcash community to understand our role and the impact of our work. So through Shielded Dialogues, we'll provide updates and deeper discussions to supplement what we post in forums and blogs. Whether you're an active community member or just looking to learn more, this is another way to stay informed. Today, we're going to be discussing the network sustainability mechanism and why we think it's important to include in the next major network upgrade, which is NU7. The NSM is a modification to the current issuance mechanism that allows ZEC to be removed from circulation and later recycled into future block rewards to help sustain the network. This addresses concerns about long-term network sustainability, similar to those raised in Bitcoin, where declining block subsidies may lead to insufficient miner revenue from transaction fees. It introduces a number of use cases for Zcash, including enabling donations directly to the network rather than to organizations or individuals, and all sorts of interesting fee models. I'm joined by Nate Wilcox, the lead engineer of Shielded Labs. Nate's been with Zcash since the beginning. He previously served as the CTO and later head of research for the Electric Coin Company, and he's also the architect of the NSM, who wrote the initial technical specification back in 2020. Nate, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. Glad to be here.
In your opinion, why should the NSM be included in NU7 instead of waiting for future network upgrade?
So I think the NSM is relatively simple. It's already implemented. We're pretty confident that it's safe and secure and that it improves the economics of the network. So another piece is the sooner we can get it in, the sooner it starts having an effect. But more importantly, the sooner it sets a precedent and sends a message kind of to the general public that Zcash has a monetary system kind of like Bitcoin's, where the emission curve is limited in the same way, but also Zcash is still evolving in multiple ways. It has this really strong privacy technology, and also it has economic changes to make the network more sustainable and to address security in the long run.
Okay, those are some great points. Yeah, a major reason I support including it in NU7 is that I feel that there's community support for adding it to the protocol. Like our goal from the beginning has always been to introduce this modest version of the NSM that establishes its basic functionality and then leave discussions about fee models and use cases for the community to decide once it's operational. So I think one big benefit is, activating the NSM and NU7 will allow us to shift the conversation away from whether or not to include the NSM and instead focus on how it should be used, what fee models make sense and what new use cases it enables, which I think you touched on a bit. But it ultimately allows us to sort of separate out the technical implementation from governance discussions about its application.
Yeah, agreed.
So from a technical perspective, how much development effort is required to include the NSM in NU7?
The changes are really simple. In fact, that's true for both the design and the code. So like the design uh, is is basically the way I got to it is hey, if we keep the constraint of a Bitcoin-like curve, but we want a way to um, recycle fees into issuance, what's the simplest way to do that? Um, and that's what I came up with. And in design discussions with the broader Zcash dev community, um, people asked about doing it in different ways, and there was discussion about different ways. But I feel like uh, we pretty much came to the consensus, or at least I came to the conclusion that all of the other ways are a little bit more complicated. Um, so the design seems to be like the simplest thing that accomplishes the goals, and then the code is also relatively simple. It changes how issuance works, so that's a big deal, but it's simple code.
Mhm.
In fact, in my view, it's even simpler than the halving, because the halving you have to, there's a function that like runs a loop and determines which block height you're at, and has this thing that divides at the right time, and you need to make sure all of those stages are correct and adjusted for any changes we've had um, to like the block target rate or things like that. Whereas the new issuance mechanism in the network in the NSM just follows this really simple rule for every block. It just figures out what's the 21 million cap, what's the current supply, and it just takes that difference and takes a tiny proportion of that and distributes it into the block.
Yeah, I do remember that there were some alternatives to specifically ZIP 234 that smooths the issuance curve that were brought up in some of the conversations in the Arborist calls and also on the forum, and they didn't turn out to be as efficient or easily to implement than what you had originally proposed. And I also thought it was interesting in a recent forum post. Josh from ECC mentioned that after consulting with ECC engineers, he does not believe the team does not believe that the NSM would delay the NU7 timeline. So, that sort of helps assure that including the NSM is a realistic addition to what's already planned for NU7. My understanding is most of the work is tied to ZIP 233, which allows ZEC to be removed from circulation. The other two zips, the one that smooths out the issuance curve and another that removes a percent of transaction fees from circulation, require minimal code changes. But I think a more important point is that with regard to ZIP 233 is that it involves modifications to the transaction format, and those similar changes are already happening as part of the work on Zcash shielded assets. So it seems like an ideal time to implement it.
Right. It's advantageous to bundle transaction format changes together. The fewer of those that there are, the nicer it can be for the ecosystem, because rolling out each transaction format change requires new support by, wallets and anyone else who's managing transactions directly. And there's another piece which is currently with NU7 with ZSAs, the Zcash shielded assets, and the NSM. They're both modifying the transaction format, and ideally they can both be integrated for NU7. But the two features aren't directly interacting yet. But I do think that NSM is really complementary to ZSAs. So I'm hoping in future versions, as we learn more about how ZSAs work and maybe there's more and more use cases evolving, the NSM will already be there as a way to process fees.
So what immediate use cases does the NSM enable that you're most excited about?
Yeah, so as soon as it activates, I'm personally interested in various like speculative use cases that aren't necessarily tied directly to consensus, but come from people observing the blockchain and seeing um, uh, ZEC being burned, right? So the change to the transaction format is to have an explicit field for burning ZEC, whereas today that only happens implicitly through a few different ways. But this makes an explicit field. And then I'm really interested in being able to attach data, to the transactions that are burning that ZEC, so that people can build different kinds of applications on that. So one example would be there's a forum, and you can up or downvote things based on burning ZEC. And so it's anonymous, and you can just see like a rating of how much ZEC was burned to upvote or downvote something. So that might just be like a fun social thing. Another thought I've had is I think it would be interesting to have a system where when you burn ZEC, you can also associate it with like a signing key. So this would be a totally pseudonymous sort of publication system where people could register their signing key accounts. And this would be on, this isn't directly on consensus, but could be off chain. But the record of it is global on the Zcash blockchain. Maybe a third idea is you could burn ZEC to claim names, to have something like ENS or domain name system. But these are all just speculative. The thing I'm really excited about is none of those require changing consensus. So as soon as NSM is there and there's this new transaction format change, people can start like experimenting with different applications like this without waiting for, an NU8 or whatever. Yeah. And all of those experiments, if any of them catch on, they're feeding into the sustainability of Zcash network.
Yeah, one of the use cases that I'm really excited about is legacy support fees that you've written a bit about. And the idea here is to disincentivize the use of older protocol technology and compensate the network for the costs of maintaining it. So, recently there's been a lot of talk around deprecating the Sprout pool, and the legacy support fees could encourage users with funds in Sprout to migrate to Orchard or Sapling. And then like attached to that, again, these are sort of down the road, but a similar concept that I find compelling is applying fees to those who hold ZEC in transparent addresses. So users who store or transact with ZEC in transparent addresses could be charged a fee to account for the opportunity cost of maintaining a larger anonymity set. And something like this, I think, could help incentivize more people to hold and use shielded ZEC and, actually take advantage of Zcash's privacy preserving technology. Of course, there might be some, this might be a controversial change for some users that would require significant discussion within the community, but I think it's worth considering as a way to grow shielded adoption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as with anything, there's trade-offs, and a big trade-off Zcash made from the beginning was, forking Bitcoin, inheriting all of the design and a lot of the infrastructure code. And so that's how we got started with Shielded. Sorry, my cat wants to participate. That's how we got started with transparent support, which is Bitcoin technology. And the advantage of that is it's possible to plug in Bitcoin-centric code with just minor tweaks to support Zcash, and that's great. The disadvantage is we have to continue to support all of that Bitcoin logic as we move forward. And some people want to turn it off or deprecate it, and there's pros and cons on either side. But maybe one way to simplify that decision is if we have fees for using transparent, that gives us, instead of having to make the decision all at once, like we're going to turn everything off or we're not going to turn it off, adding fees is a way to kind of turn up the heat or turn the knob a little bit and see how the ecosystem reacts in order to inform our decisions moving forward. Like, oh, this is working well, it's not bothering too many users. In that case, maybe we could then decide to turn off the support, or we turn on the fees. It's not working well. It turns out, it's breaking really popular use cases, and that's harming like the network effect or things like that. Then we would learn from that. In either case, we don't have to make like the harder decision of all or nothing right off the bat. We can use these softer means to sort of get feedback from the ecosystem.
We've got a little time left. Do you want to speak a little bit about dynamic fees and how that plays or touches on the NSM?
Yeah, so the NSM is largely actually inspired by EIP 1559 in Ethereum. And a bit of trivia is Vitalik filed a ticket that's over on the Zcash GitHub that's really old, and it's much older than EIP 1559, where he's basically saying, "Hey, why doesn't Zcash do this thing?" Um, so EIP 1559, what it does is it requires in consensus that a portion of transaction fees get burnt. And then separately, Ethereum's issuance is some algorithm, and it sort of adjusts based on how much stake there is and yada yada. That one's a little more complicated, and we're not emulating that. But the big picture is that it has a way to like burn ETH to remove it from circulation, and then a way to issue it. And those both react to what's going on in the network, like how many transactions are there per time. So the NSM as it is today, ready for NU7, is sort of akin to part of that, except it's fitting the Bitcoin issuance curve. And that's the issuance side. But the burning side, we add burning for transaction fees, but we're not changing how transaction fees work today. And the way transaction fees work today is pretty good for now. One reason it's good is that fees are just very consistent for users. And that works up until blocks get full. So if there's ever a condition where blocks are getting full because there's like a spike in demand or usage, then the fee system isn't going to work very well. And I think the general experience many users will have is their transactions just don't go through, and there's nothing they can do about it. They just need to wait for the network to cool down. Switching to dynamic fees would be a way to basically change that fee rate when there's more usage of the network. And so what that would do is the network would kind of automatically adjust to spikes in demand or lowering demand. And that would allow users to adjust what they're doing or how they're using the network in reaction to how much demand there is for the network. So if demand increased for the network, but we haven't been able to roll out a scalability improvement yet, fees would just continue to rise, but whoever's paying that newer, higher rate will still have relatively good service. So, a lot of users who were paying a lower rate might be priced out, and so it's not going to work for them in either case. Whether or not, like if we don't have dynamic fees, but the network gets congested, it's not going to work for them or anyone else. If we have dynamic fees, it's still not going to work for users who are constrained by lower fees, but it will continue to work for users who are willing to pay higher fees. So it's like, it's not a good situation for the network to be overcapacity in some regards. It's good in other regards because that means many people are using it, so it's valuable. But it's an outage for somebody. And the question is that just going to be everyone randomly, or is it going to be only the people who aren't willing to pay more for that value? Yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, and so this protects the network in a scenario where there is an organic, dramatic increase in users or there's a spam attack similar to what we saw a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
And ZIP 317, which is currently active, doesn't address those concerns with its model.
Right, it does not. What it did do, though, is it made sure that um, so with ZIP 317, there's like basically a fixed fee schedule, but the fees for any given transaction are roughly corresponding to how costly that transaction is to compute.
Mhm.
Um, so it evens the playing field for all transaction types for a fixed schedule. Dynamic fees would have the sort of base fee rate move up and down with network usage.
Okay, great.
Um, yeah, and there's one other piece I wanted to mention, which is, a lot of times, if I'm so one reason I want dynamic fees is in case there's a spike in demand. A lot of times there's like a common engineering wisdom that you don't need to build out a really sophisticated thing until you have users. And so that's sort of an argument not to uh, work hard on scalability too early. And this sounds sort of like a scalability thing, but I think it's a little bit different because it's more about, I think it's somewhat likely that the way adoption happens is in waves. And I just want Zcash to be prepared if there's a wave of adoption. And one way that might happen is if people realize um, they need privacy and they need strong security. And few blockchains have privacy, and a lot of them actually don't have that great of security. I think Zcash is really solid on both fronts. So if there's any sort of event, which seems fairly plausible to me, like I don't know, a big war or something, and there is, Chainalysis keeps advancing, and then that feeds into this dynamic where a bunch of people who are, needing secure private wealth storage and transfer might discover that Zcash is what they've been needing.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a tipping point with regards to financial policy. I'm sorry, financial privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, and we've seen waves of adoption in 2017 and 2020. So, I agree with you there. And it sounds like, these generally follow like a 4-year cycle. So, um, we could probably see something in the next year or two. But to wrap up, what are your final thoughts on why including the NSM and NU7 is important?
I feel like the most important thing is just the message, like just to distill the message for people who don't pay that much attention to Zcash. It's like, oh, Zcash, oh, that's that privacy chain over there. I've heard about it has good privacy tech. Maybe they don't pay that much attention, but now they're hearing a new message, which is, oh, Zcash is like innovating on the tokenomics, but it still has the sort of Bitcoin guarantee of scarcity. Um, I think that's the big picture message, and sending that out soon sort of, I hope, widens the Overton window of potential users to realize Zcash is more than just really good privacy tech.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts with us today, Nate. It's really helpful to hear your perspective on this to help the community better understand our reasons for including the NSM in NU7. And to anyone watching that has questions or wants to continue the discussion, feel free to join the conversation on the forum or reach out to me or Nate via DM on X. Thanks for tuning in. I'm looking forward to more discussions like this in future episodes.
All right, thanks.